Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Leanne Burr, and you are with Brainwave GRC. And today's subject of our webinar is, what if you didn't have IT general controls? So today you're going to be hearing from two speakers. The first one is myself, Leanne Burr. I'm actually in sales and marketing operations. I'm located here in the United States. And my colleague, Khadija Elafrit, is a professional services consultant with Brainwave also. Khadija, can you say hello?
Yes, hi everyone. So I'm Khadija. I'm a professional services consultant at Brainwave GRC. I'm based in the Paris area in France, and I mostly work with our clients who purchase Brainwave GRC solutions and helping them implement and making these solutions evolve within their information system.
Thank you very much for that. So let's get started here. Khadija, can you help us? What we're going to talk about today to start with is the principles of IT general controls. Can you help us learn a little bit more about this, Khadija?
Sure, Leanne. So before diving into IT general controls, let's take a higher level of analysis by first mentioning what would be a typical audit and internal control process. So within our clients, what we see is that they mostly have a three-tier internal compliance process when it comes to internal control, with a first level of permanent control that is declined among operational and technical stakeholders. So basically, these are controls that any kind of line manager or resource owners would implement, and the purpose would be to have to have a look at what your teams are able to access, what operations do they conduct on a regular basis. And among and beyond these, this first level of permanent controls, when you consolidate all kinds of data from your respective business departments, you get a second level of permanent controls that can be conducted on this consolidated data. And this second level of controls would include risk assessments and any kind of independent control that would be launched at any time of the year. And these controls would be taken care of by dedicated teams, whether it be internal control or risk management and compliance departments. The third level of controls within this three-tier process deals with higher level controls, either to investigate any kind of incident that happened recently, or to prevent any kind of incident from happening by setting up periodic controls to check, to make sure that your organization is compliant with the rules and regulations that apply to your industry. And at this third level of internal controls, you'll find internal or external auditors, and sometimes these controls could even be handled by the compliance authorities that are responsible for the regulations that apply to you. And the key to making this process work is to make sure that at the root of your three-tier process, your operational permanent controls are made as simple and as efficient as possible. So to serve that purpose, that's where the IT general controls framework would come in handy. So here you can see an overview of the main components that would be part of an IT general controls framework. And within that framework, that is supposed to help you make sure that you have a good knowledge about who does what in your organization. The most important components that we'll focus on today are the logical access control to programs or applications and to data. And alongside this need for logical access control, there are also other features that Brainwave GRC solutions can provide with, such as recertification or segregation of duties, which we'll also mention later on during this webinar.
Let's transport ourselves to a universe where one of our collaborators has left the company, but his counts have remained active. Do you have an example of this for us today?
Indeed, Leanne. So first, let's study the context that may make that happen. So let's assume that your corporation has a bunch of admin users. And among these admin users, you may have a bitter, soon to be ex employee, but not just any kind of bitter employee. It may be someone that you would lay off or someone who resigns to maybe create their own company on the side. But this kind of employee would have access to sensitive assets and would have enough time and knowledge to cause some irreparable damage to your organization. So if your corporation ends up in such a context, well, what could happen would be either any kind of sabotage and disruption of your activities. So you could imagine this former employee of yours deleting some sensitive data, shutting down some servers, and basically messing up with your core applications or your core services in terms of IT assets. Or they could decide to conduct a more silent kind of attack where they would keep accessing your IT systems, but not to perform any disruption. They would mostly log in regularly to copy and leak some data. So it could be client databases, financial reports, data related to intellectual property or trade secrets. Which could be pretty harmful if they ended up going to your competition, if they decided to hire your former employee, or which could help your employee set up their own company that could become your own competition. So your former employee with admin accesses might not care about the impacts that this would entail on your organization, but you do. And when that happens, the impacts that you're looking at are um, mostly loss of customer base or loss of staff to the competition if the new employer decides to, for example, hire this former admin's colleagues. You would need also to prepare for lawsuits in case your customers decide to sue you because of the disruption or because of the sabotage that happened. And on a more concrete level, you would also need to spend lots and lots of money and resources to rebuild your infrastructure, to rebuild your IT assets in case of a sabotage. So that would be the typical context for such a disruption.
So do we have a real life example of this happening out there in the world?
Well, Leanne, I can think of a few. The first one that comes to mind happened with Cisco actually back in 2018. So all the examples, all the stories that are part of this webinar have actually been made public. You can find about them in the news, so it's nothing confidential here, of course. So what happened at Cisco was that back in 2018, they had this admin, that system admin that decided to resign and join another company. And a few months later, in September 2018, this former admin in California decided to log into the Cisco infrastructure and to delete over 400 WebEx servers, so the servers that were hosting the WebEx service that Cisco is offering. And by doing that, this former admin also deleted over 16,000 accounts from Cisco's clients. So it caused a major disruption on the WebEx service, which took 2 weeks to recover from. And if you want to have a concrete, a good idea of what it may cost when that happens, so Cisco had to spend $2.4 million to rebuild their WebEx service. It was something like $1 million in man days and $1.4 million in IT expenditures. As for the former employee, so Cisco decided to sue them, and the court sentence for this former admin was 2 years of prison and a $15,000 fine. So that's the more obvious and recent case that happened with that scenario, but you can also think of a few other data breaches or sabotages that happened because of either former employees leaving or because of poor management of admin accesses. So it also happened to Equifax with admin accounts with the password admin, actually, or the U.S. Navy, who had a former systems admin that decided to hack into more than 30 organizations, among which the U.S. Navy themselves, but also some universities or police departments within the United States.
So, Khadija, how could this all have been avoided?
Well, we can think of a few examples of IT general controls that could help prevent that. If these corporations had some better both permanent and event-based controls, it could have helped reduce the risk of such attacks occurring. So when it comes to permanent controls, we can think of a few. I personally would recommend these corporations to check any kind of active account that belongs to users who left the organization. That would be my first go-to ITGC control, actually. And beside that, I would also recommend to monitor the use of orphan accounts or dormant accounts or accounts with no owners, mostly because your IT admin could be a bit smarter and decide not to use their own accounts with their own names, but they may leave your organization with knowledge about generic accounts or technical accounts and their passwords and decide to use them because that's something that often happens. You'll have generic accounts that will be shared among admin departments or managed service departments in your IT division. So you might also need to keep a look at those. And when it comes to event-based controls, so if you want to set up controls that would be triggered based on a specific event, the most obvious one would be, of course, to use the departure of a user as the triggering event. But you could also imagine other kinds of triggers, such as checking any kind of accesses or permissions belonging to users who changed their departments, who moved from a job function to another, or even if that applies to your corporation, to check accesses belonging to users who declared a conflict of interest, if that's something you need to abide by. So that would be the main controls I would recommend to avoid such a scenario happening to you.
Perfect, Khadija. Thank you very much. So, in another intergalactic scenario, what if your rogue trader made fraudulent transaction and was able to cover his tracks? What do we know about this, and what can we learn about today, Khadija?
So here we're dealing with financial fraud, which may have even higher stakes than the first scenario that we mentioned a few minutes ago. So in these kinds of financial fraud scenarios, the higher stakes would be to make sure that you can have tools and infrastructures that would help you detect and prevent financial fraud from happening, and would also help you to mitigate the risk of human error while making sure that you comply to the regulations that apply to your industry and to the country where you're based. And so here, one of the main topics, of course, will be segregation of duties, which is about making sure that your users don't handle combinations of permissions that enable them to do to perform fraudulent transactions. So how can we help organizations preventing any kind of financial fraud? So in this universe, the main ingredients that would make that kind of financial fraud occur would be if you're in an organization that has poor management or poor governance about access management for people who move within the organization, who change departments or who change job functions, and who are able to keep the access rights from their former job, even after they moved from their former department, and can combine their former access rights with the access rights that they're granted for their new job. If you add to that an HR policy that in many corporations would enable massive risk taking, where, for example, your employees would be incentivized with sales-based incentives based on sales targets or revenue targets, combined with lower fixed wages. Then here you would have all the ingredients for an explosive financial fraud situation. So in these kinds of environments, you could have multiple kinds of frauds happening. So it could be embezzlement, where your purchasing managers would create fake suppliers and transfer them money, or even real suppliers, but pay them more than what the market prices would be, and then it would be leading to bribery afterwards. You could also be facing securities frauds, which is the scenario that the title of this section is based on, where you would have a trader performing risky transactions and not covering them properly. Or you could also be facing financial fraud, where your accountants would inflate the revenue data within your financial reports by creating many fictitious clients, and creating also fictitious money transfers to pretend that your company's revenues are higher than what they actually are. And here, the types of impacts that you would face would also be pretty serious, actually. So at the minimum, you would be facing huge financial losses or stock market value drops if these financial fraud cases go public. And in the case they go public, beyond that, you would also need, of course, to deal with the damage control costs. You may be facing class actions from shareholders, for example. You might need to spend a lot in communication to restore your reputation with the public. And in the most severe cases, the corporation's top management could even be facing jail sentences or fines, depending on the authorities that prosecute them. So here's what could happen in that universe.
So what superpowers could have been used to prevent this from happening?
Well, before that, I'd like to tell you a bit more about the true story behind the title of this section. So in France, as you may know, Leanne, we've actually had one of our major banks who had a rogue trader that made them lose so much money, and it went public and worldwide, if I remember correctly. So let me tell you about this. So back in 2005 to 2007, that trader used to hold a front office position after a former position as a middle office manager. And as a front office trader, he began trading on riskier and riskier assets up until he was holding over $50 billion of risky assets with fictitious coverage that he was able to hide from his upper management. And just to give you just to make you understand what that represents, actually $50 billion at the time was even higher than Société Générale's actual stock market value. So that's what this front office trader on his own was holding. And then what happened was that in January 2008, that financial fraud has been identified by Société Générale's top management, and they had to sell these risky assets. But unfortunately, that happened when there was already a bearish market that was beginning, and that made them lose around $5 billion just for the closing of these risky positions. And since they had to make it public, go public, so the Société Générale stock value dropped 20% the following week. And they also had to go through a worldwide damage when it comes to their reputation. And even in France, it was especially hard because many financial advisors within Société Générale's agencies throughout the country were dealing with angry clients who who were very angry at them and mentioned this scandal whenever there would be any kind of litigious transactions. And after that, beyond this $5 billion loss, Société Générale had to invest over $200 million in securing their trading activities and reinforcing their IT cybersecurity processes and solutions, and in repurposing the middle office and internal control processes. So that was one of the most famous cases that involved segregation of duties, toxic combinations, because he did hold both middle office permissions, middle office accounts, and front office activities. Such financial frauds were also seen at other corporations such as Wells Fargo, that may have been also a famous case in the US, or BMW also. So here's an example of what actually happened in terms of financial fraud. So back to your question, Leanne, you were asking what could be done to prevent such a scenario. So here, for any corporation that wishes to avoid that from happening, I would recommend mostly to set up any kind of segregation of duties, rules, controls, and reports to make sure that they can have a view of who holds toxic permissions, who has the potential of conducting financial fraud, so that they can be either remediated. So for example, you could say that, okay, this person holds two conflicting permissions, maybe one of them needs to be revoked. Or in case there is no other way, in case, for example, their team is too small to have segregation of duties, then at least it would be tracked and monitored, and it would come with mitigation controls. So that would be the best recommendation in terms of permanent ITGC. When it comes to event-based controls, what would be my recommendation would be to set up alerts, for example, if a new permission is granted that triggers a toxic combination of permissions. And also, I would recommend to make sure you have periodic access review campaigns, either focused on any person in the organization, or focused only on people who change departments, such as, for example, if it happened at Société Générale, then Jérôme, this trader would have left the middle office departments without middle office department accesses, and they would only have the front office accesses, and maybe at least part of this financial fraud would have been avoided. So that would be my general recommendation on what could have been done to avoid such a scenario.
Khadija, thank you so much for explaining these two scenarios for us and giving us the solutions that you would propose to them. So let's take a brief look at the IT general controls and risk mitigation. Let's look at what we talked about today, and then we'll get to your questions towards the end. By the way, if you have any questions, I forgot to mention that you can ask them in our chat, and we'll be glad to answer them shortly. So, what are the advantages of using permanent controls? Well, here's 4 of them that we can share with you. First of all, as you've seen in this presentation, you reduce your exposure to risk. You can prevent fraud, increase your cyber defense, and the 4th thing is to demonstrate compliance. And as we all know, today the user access compliance can take up a lot of time for an organization with little added value. So the next question would be, why is it so complex to do permanent controls? So we're going to, you can see here on the screen a couple of the reasons why it is so complex for companies to do this. A few of them being for instance, how do we know who can access or what resource? A lot of times we have data quality issues, and we have compliance requirements. So we have all of these things to contend with. And so it becomes very, very complex. And the basic reason for this is because there is no automation. So this is what we talked about today. And what we're going to show you is, if you do automate it, how can it help you? So what does identity analytics, what do they deliver and help you with? Look at some of these return on investments here. First of all, you can have an 80% cost savings on certification. That's huge. You can reduce by 10 times the tasks that you do linked with compliance. You can improve your remediation accuracy by 50%. So there's just a wrap up there of the summary. And now we're going to ask Khadija to wrap things up a little bit to explain to our listeners how they can automate their IT general controls with Brainwave.
Sure, Leanne. So I'll just show again the typical three-tier internal control process. And next to it, you can see for each tier of this process, a small list of Brainwave features that could help you enhance these controls. I'm not going to quote all of them, but basically for the first level of permanent controls, Brainwave can offer to line managers or organization managers or application owners enough reports and KPIs where they could see at a glance what their users might be up to, who has access to the resources that they manage, what their team members are able to do. When it comes to the second level of permanent controls, we can also provide consolidated reports that are available to auditors or to risk managers with some access review features, some monitoring features, or remediation also. And for the third level, with periodic controls, so one of Brainwave's GRC's strongest suits is actually the access review process. So we can help you automate your access review campaigns throughout the year, depending on the actors you need to review the accesses, whether it be line managers or app owners or any other kind of reviewers that you would need to request help from. These are a few of Brainwave GRC's features to help you set up an internal complaints process, and this can give you both operational level information and also consolidated data that could be very useful to your top auditors, your risk managers, and even to the CEO or to the board of your company.
So now the big question, how about taking the next step with Brainwave? Now that you have seen what we can do for you with regards to your ITGCs, we are here to help you. And we'd like to thank you for attending. And we have a few minutes left. We hope you can stick around here with us. We want to answer a few of your questions. So let's get to it. And Khadija, I hope you can stick around and help me with some of these. I've been reading through them
sure,
as we
take a few questions.
Yeah, let's take a few. So let me hold on one second. Let me just scroll through here what we've received. The person asks, how long would it take to automate ITGC controls?
Okay, so that's a pretty interesting question. There are two parameters you need to have in mind to get an estimate of the duration that it would require. So the duration would depend on the number and complexity of data sources that you would need to import within the Brainwave platform. And it would also depend on the number of custom controls and processes that you would need to enhance using Brainwave GRC. But just to give you an example, over the past few months, we helped an investment management company set up a Brainwave portal to perform controls on their privileged accesses to especially local accounts to many servers that they needed to track, and it took around 3 to 4 weeks to set up a Brainwave portal using both our standard ITGC controls, because so the Brainwave GRC platform comes up with around 1,000 standard ITGC controls that are natively available. And in addition to that, of course, during these 3 to 4 weeks, our colleagues were able to import their access rights data from the HR system, from the Active Directory, and from the local servers that were to be monitored with some specific controls dealing with these servers. For larger corporations, we've also had examples where at least for, let's say, 10,000 identities and around 10 to 15 applications to which we wanted to monitor access rights data. Basically, a first implementation for these for corporations of these sizes would take between a few months to up to 6 months.
Okay, very good. That was very thorough. Thanks a lot, Khadija. So
Sure.
I'm actually going to regroup two questions that we had into one here for you. Both of the people were concerned about data leak prevention. Is there anything that you can talk to us about in that subject?
Right. So when it comes to data leak prevention, Brainwave also has some features about data governance. So in the same way that we're able to track privileged accesses or accesses to sensitive applications, we're also able to monitor accesses to non-structured data. So that would be mostly shared folders, either within your local storage or your Office 365 accounts. And assuming our client can provide us with access rights data to these folders and 80 groups details, we're able to rebuild the chain of accesses to your non-structured folders. So we're able to tell you who has access to each folder, when did they actually access it, and we also have around 10 to 20 controls in our ITGC control library that are dealing with non-structured data accesses.
Okay, thank you. I hope that answered the question for those two people. And then we have a more specific one here at the end of hopefully this should be the last one because I think we're running out of time. But the last question that was specific would be, it says, can we take a look at the way that these ITGC controls are displayed in the Brainwave software?
Well, so here we might not have enough time, of course, to give you an overview of these ITGC controls and the way they would show up in the Brainwave platform, but I would advise you to contact our wonderful sales team and marketing team to request for a custom demo that I may be conducting for you or my colleagues may be conducting for you.
That's a great idea. Thank you, Khadija. So thank you for all of your input for us. Thank you for your questions that we got, and thank you for attending our webinar today on ITGC controls. Please follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn, and if you have any additional questions, anything we can answer for you or your specific project, don't hesitate to reach us on brainwavegrc.com. You can fill out the contact us form, and we will be glad to get back to you. For all those in attendance, you'll be receiving a copy of this webinar in your inbox very shortly. And again, thank you for attending. Thank you, Khadija.
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you,
And
everyone, for
we hope to,
attending.
yes, we hope to see you guys very soon here at Brainwave. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, everyone. Have a nice end of day.